The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Maura Felton would later decide was the cruelest part of it. Not a Monday, when the week already felt like a punishment. Not a Friday, when there was at least the small mercy of 2 days to fall apart in private. A Tuesday, the most ordinary day God ever made, and it was the day her father sold her. She was hanging wash on the line behind the house when her younger brother ran out to tell her. He was 9, and he thought it was exciting, a rancher, a real one, coming to the house with papers and a leather satchel and boots that weren't held together with twine. Maura didn't share his enthusiasm. She walked inside with a wet shirt still in her hands and stood in the doorway of the front room and looked at the man sitting across from her father at the table. He wasn't what she expected. She didn't know what she expected. His name was Reid Calloway, and he was 38 years old, and he owned the largest working cattle operation in Cutter's Bend, Wyoming. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and hands that were folded on top of the table, like he was waiting for something he already knew was coming. He looked at her when she came in, not the way men usually looked at her, not measuring or hungry or dismissive. He just looked, the way a person looks at something they've been waiting a long time to see, and then he looked away. Her father's name was Owen Felton, and he owed $1,200 to a man named Garrett Voss, and Garrett Voss was not a patient man. Owen had been borrowing and promising and borrowing again for 3 years. The drought had come and taken the crops, and then a river flood took the equipment, and then bad judgment took the rest. He was not a bad man. Maura had long since stopped calling him that, even in her own mind, but he was a weak one, and weakness had a way of making decisions that strength would never countenance. Reid Calloway had paid the debt, all of it, in full, that morning before he came to the house. The arrangement, as Owen explained it, was that Maura would go to the Calloway ranch and work as a housekeeper, and cook for a period of no less than 2 years, at the end of which the debt would be considered settled, and she would be free to go wherever she chose. She would receive room and board. She would not be mistreated. Owen said this last part looking at the table, not at his daughter. Maura stood in the doorway, holding the wet shirt, and did not say a word for a long time. Then she said, "Did anyone think to ask me?" Neither man answered, which was answer enough. She was packed and gone by the following morning. The Calloway Ranch sat 14 miles outside of Cutter's Bend at the end of a road that was more suggestion than fact, cutting through open grassland that went on so long in every direction it made a person feel like the sky had weight. There was a main house, 2 bunkhouses, a barn big enough to swallow the house she'd grown up in, and a woman named Dottie Briggs who served as the only other female presence on the property and who met Maura at the door with coffee and a look that said she'd seen this situation before, in various forms, and had opinions about it. "He's not cruel," Dottie said before Maura had even set down her bag. "I need you to know that from the start. Whatever you're thinking, you're probably wrong." "I'm thinking I didn't choose to be here," Maura said. "No," Dottie agreed. "But a lot of people end up places they didn't choose. Doesn't make the place bad." Maura didn't argue. She was too tired to argue, and she'd learned early that argument without leverage was just noise. Reid Calloway did not appear to formally greet her. She learned later that he'd ridden out before dawn and didn't come back until after dark, which was apparently his standard practice during the spring gather. Dottie showed her the kitchen, the larder, the sleeping room off the back of the main house that would be hers, the small window that looked out toward the eastern pasture where the light hit different in the morning, golden and low, the kind of light that made even difficult things look possible for a moment. Maura sat on the edge of the narrow bed that night and did not cry. She had decided, somewhere on the road between her father's house and this one, that crying was a thing she would not do, not where anyone could see, not in a house where she had no say. She cried anyway, very quietly, with her face turned toward the wall, and then she stopped and she went to sleep, and in the morning she got up and she made biscuits. The kitchen was where she first began to understand. Something was off about her assumptions. There was nothing in that kitchen to suggest neglect. The pans were seasoned and heavy, the kind that took years of use to build up right. The spice shelf was organized and full, not the basics of a bachelor household, but the kind of variety that suggested someone who actually intended to cook well. There was a small tin of good black tea on the second shelf, and next to it, inexplicably, a book, not a ranch ledger. A novel, Maura discovered when she pulled it out. Dog-eared to about the halfway point, spine cracked from use. She put it back and didn't mention it. The first time she cooked a real meal, roast with root vegetables, cornbread, a pot of beans, Reid Calloway came in from the range with 2 of his ranch hands, sat at the long table and ate without ceremony. He thanked her when he was finished. The words were simple and direct, and he looked at her when he said them, which she noticed because most men thanked the general air above a woman's head. "You don't have to cook like this," he said.
Dottie does well enough with the basics. I cook like this because it's how I cook, Maura said.
She hadn't meant it to come out sharp.
It did anyway.
He just nodded, like sharpness was neither here nor there, and went back to his study. She stood in the kitchen and stared at the place he'd been sitting, and couldn't figure out what to make of him.
It was Dottie who told her about the wife. Her name had been Patricia, and she'd died 4 years ago, and before that she'd been sick for a long time, longer than anyone had said publicly, because Patricia Calloway had been a private woman and had wanted it kept quiet. No children. They'd tried. The grief of that had come in layers, Dottie said, stacked on top of the larger grief, and Reid had carried all of it mostly alone because that was how he'd been built. He was different before, Dottie said, not unkind, just matter of fact. Lighter, I guess you'd say. He used to laugh more.
Patricia used to say he laughed too much, actually, that he needed to take things more seriously. Dottie's mouth did something complicated. I think she'd regret saying that if she could see him now. Maura thought about that for several days. She thought about grief as a kind of construction, the way it changed the architecture of a person, closed off certain rooms, reinforced certain walls, made the exterior harder than the interior warranted. She recognized it, if she was honest.
She'd been building similar things herself, floor by floor,
since she was old enough to understand that her father's weakness would eventually cost her something she couldn't get back.
She hadn't expected it to cost her this, but maybe she should have.
The first real conversation she had with Reid Calloway happened by accident, 3 weeks in, on an evening when the sky turned green and the wind came up hard from the northwest, and everyone who knew anything about Wyoming weather started moving fast. The hands got the horses in. Dottie got herself to the storm cellar. Maura, who was new and had grown up in the flatter part of the territory where weather came differently, was standing on the porch with her hand braced on the post watching the sky when Reid appeared beside her and said, without preamble, "You need to go inside. I'm watching it," she said. "I can see that."
"Go inside anyway. I want to see where it tracks."
He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same sky she was looking at.
Then he said, "Southwest. It'll pass north of us, but there'll be hail."
She turned to look at him. His face was angled up, reading the clouds like they were a language he'd been fluent in for years. "How can you tell?" she asked. He told her.
He used words she half understood.
About pressure and color and the way the grass bent, and she listened not because she particularly wanted to learn to read Wyoming weather, but because something in his voice changed when he was talking about it. The clipped quality left. He talked like a man who knew what he loved, even if he'd forgotten he loved it. The hail came. They ended up on the porch together for 40 minutes. Because by the time the ice started there was no point running, and Reid Calloway held the door shut against the wind, and Maura watched the stones bounce off the barn roof and thought, "This is not what I imagined this would be." She didn't know exactly what she had imagined. Something worse, probably. Something easier to be angry about. She found out about the other part. The part that changed everything, 6 weeks after she arrived, and she found out from the wrong person, in the wrong way, which seemed fitting given how the rest of it had started. She'd ridden into Cutter's Bend with Dottie for supplies. It was a market day, loud and crowded, and while Dottie was at the dry goods counter, a woman named Cecily Pratt, who clearly had strong feelings about many things and limited compunctions about sharing them, planted herself next to Maura and said, conversationally,
"You're the Felton girl, aren't you?"
"The one Calloway took on." Maura said she was. Cecily looked at her for a moment with an expression that was trying to decide between sympathy and gossip and landed, as these things usually did, on gossip.
"Did he tell you he knew you before?" Maura went still. "I'm sorry, he knew your family."
"When you were young, you were, what, 12? 13? That winter your mother was dying, before your father went under."
Calloway was still building his operation then.
"He came through your county on a cattle drive, and he said later." Cecily paused, seeming to recalibrate how much she was about to say.
"Well, he said certain things, to certain people."
"About wanting to see you settled safe somewhere, not in the way people make it sound when they say it about a girl," she added quickly. "More like, he felt responsible. For some reason." Maura stood in the middle of the market street and felt the ground do something peculiar under her feet.
"What reason?" she asked.
But Cecily had apparently run up against the limits of what she actually knew, and the rest was just supposition, which even Cecily seemed to recognize wasn't worth trading on. She didn't ask Reid about it directly, not that night or the next. She turned it over instead, the way she turned over difficult things. Quietly, away from eyes, in the small hours when the ranch was asleep and she could sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and think without anyone asking her to arrive at a conclusion. She knew the winter Cecily meant. She was 12.
Her mother had been sick since August and died in January,
and the weeks between had been the kind of weeks that stripped a household down to bone. The money gone, the warmth gone, the pretense of ordinary life packed away because there wasn't energy to maintain it. She remembered men coming and going, some to help, some to see what could be scavenged before the end. She didn't remember Reid Calloway, but she'd been 12, and grief makes children blind to certain things. What she couldn't stop thinking about was the phrase Cecily had used, wanting to see her settled somewhere safe. Not the phrase of a man who meant harm, not even the phrase of a man who meant ownership, the phrase of a man who'd seen something he couldn't fix and hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. The next evening she asked him,
"Were you there when my mother was dying? Did you come through?"
They were on the porch again. It had become a habit without either of them deciding it, the hour after supper, before the dark was fully down. He didn't answer immediately. He set his coffee cup on the railing and looked out at the pasture, and she could see him deciding how much truth to give her.
"Yes," he said. "Why didn't you say so?" "Because there was no way to say it that didn't sound like I was explaining myself, and you hadn't asked for an explanation." She thought about that. It was, she admitted privately, a more thoughtful answer than she'd expected. "What did you see?" she asked. "When you were there?"
He was quiet for a long time. The cattle were moving somewhere in the south pasture, and the sound of them drifted over, low and distant and oddly peaceful. "A girl," he said finally, "who was managing everything that needed managing, while everyone else was falling apart.
12 years old, making sure her brother ate, making sure the fire stayed lit, keeping records of the money your father couldn't keep track of."
He paused.
"I didn't forget it." Maura looked at the pasture and did not say anything. "When your father's situation got bad," Reid continued, "I heard through people. I didn't act on it fast enough. By the time I had the debt paid, Voss had already started making arrangements of his own. I stepped in before that could happen."
She turned to look at him.
"What arrangements?"
His jaw tightened.
"Nothing you'd have wanted."
She believed him. And the believing of it was the thing that cracked something open, just slightly, somewhere below her sternum.
"Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the possibility of warmth, the shape of it. You should have asked me," she said. "Even so, you should have asked me."
"Yes," he said, "I should have."
"That's the thing I'd change if I could."
She didn't stop being angry. She'd understood from an early age that anger was useful, that it moved faster than grief and kept a person warmer. But something changed in its texture after that night, the way autumn changes from the inside, the air still sharp but carrying a different intent. She stopped keeping her distance in the kitchen.
She started cooking the things she actually liked to cook, proper soups, apple cake,
the kind of bread that needed 2 days to develop. She stopped eating in the kitchen by herself and started eating at the long table, which was where Reid and the two older hands ate most evenings. She found the novel on the kitchen shelf again, Emma, which she had always privately loved, and this time when she mentioned it, he said he'd read it twice, which struck her as an extraordinary thing for a Wyoming cattle rancher to say, and she told him so.
"Patricia left it," he said. "The first time I read it was after she died. I wasn't sleeping well."
It was the first time she'd heard him say his wife's name without being asked about her. She recognized the shift, the way a person moved a thing from kept to shared. She was careful with it. "It's a good book for not sleeping," she said.
"It gives you something to argue with."
He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The trouble came in October, the way trouble usually came on the heels of something getting better. Her father arrived on a Wednesday morning with a man named Douglas Sloan, who had a courthouse manner and an unsettling habit of producing papers from nowhere. The arrangement, Sloan explained, had not been legally binding in any recognized jurisdiction. Owen Felton could, should he choose, remove his daughter from the premises, and the debt, having already been paid, would remain paid. In other words, Owen wanted her back.
Owen had, apparently, found someone he wished her to marry. A man with money.
A man from back east.
A man Maura had never met who had, somehow, already expressed interest.
She stood in the main room of Reid Calloway's house
And listened to this and felt something cold and clear settle over her. "No," she said. Owen looked surprised. He'd expected argument, probably, or tears. Not that particular word in that particular tone.
"Maura? No," she said again. "You don't get to sell me twice. It isn't like that. It's exactly like that, and you know it." She kept her voice level.
She'd had 26 years of practice keeping her voice level in this man's presence, and it served her well now. "You made an arrangement. Mr. Calloway honored it. I'm honoring it. That's the end."
Sloan attempted to explain the legal nuances. She turned to him and said, with great precision, that she was not a parcel and would not be shipped not anywhere she had not agreed to go, and that if he intended to take the matter to a judge, she would speak for herself in that courtroom, and she would not be brief. Reid, who had been standing by the window during all of this, said nothing. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Owen left. Sloan left. The papers went with them. She stood in the empty room for a moment after the sound of horses faded, and then she sat down on the bench by the door and put her face in her hands.
Not crying, just breathing, just letting the shape of it settle. Reid came and sat in the chair across from her. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. I mean, I would have gone to court if you'd wanted to leave. I wouldn't have fought it.
She lifted her face from her hands and looked at him. He meant it. She could see that he meant it, and it was possibly the most uncomplicated thing anyone had said to her in years.
I know that too,
she said. The silence between them held a different quality than it had held before, porous, somehow, like something had been removed that neither of them had realized was there. The first snow came in November, and with it a kind of settling. She started reading in the evenings in the study, which had the best lamp in the warmest corner. Reid worked at his desk most nights, ledgers, correspondence, the endless paperwork of a large operation, and she read on the chair by the window, and they talked sometimes and didn't talk other times, and both were fine.
She began to understand slowly that this was what he'd offered all along. Not control, not ownership, but proximity to something steady. She had grown up in a house that moved and shook with every change in fortune, where the ground was never guaranteed. This house did not shake, not because it was untouched by hardship, but because the man running it had decided, somewhere along the way, that he would not let hardship decide his character.
She'd been drawn to that without knowing it, had been drawn to it since the first morning when he'd thanked her for the meal and looked at her when he said it. One evening in December, when the snow was deep and the wind was loud against the glass, and she'd lost the thread of her book and set it in her lap, she said, "Why didn't you ever remarry?"
After Patricia.
He considered the question the way he considered all questions, without rushing it.
Nobody seemed right, he said. For 7 years?
I wasn't looking, he said. And then I was. He didn't say anything further, and she didn't ask him to, but she understood what he meant with a clarity that was almost physical, the way you understood the nature of weather not from being told, but from standing in it. She went back to her book. He went back to his ledger. The wind pressed against the glass and couldn't get in. She told him, in February, in the kitchen, on a Thursday morning while she was making bread, that she intended to stay, not because of the arrangement, not because she had nowhere else to go.
She had somewhere to go.
Dottie had cousins in Colorado who'd already offered, and there was a school in Laramie looking for someone who could teach reading, which Maura knew she could do. She had options.
She said it because it was the truth, and because she'd decided some time ago, quietly and without ceremony, that she was done allowing her life to be managed by people who didn't know what she needed. Reid set down the piece of correspondence he'd been reviewing and looked at her. "You're sure," he said. "I'm sure. This is a hard life," he said, "harder than it looks from a season."
I know what hard looks like, she said. I've been looking at it my whole life. She pressed her hands into the dough and felt it give under her palms. This is the first place I've been where hard and safe weren't mutually exclusive. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Maura. She looked up. He came around the table, and he stood in front of her, and he said quietly, and without any of the performance she'd have expected from a man trying to impress, I should have found a better way to do this. I should have asked you properly from the beginning. I was trying to move fast enough to keep you safe, and I didn't think clearly about what it would cost you.
No, she agreed.
You didn't. If you'll let me, I'd like to spend a considerable amount of time making up for that. She looked at him for a moment, at the gray coming in at his temples, at the hands that had spent 30 years learning this land, at the face that had been holding grief for 4 years and was, she thought,
finally setting some of it down. That's a reasonable offer, I said.
He smiled. Actually smiled, fully, and it changed his face completely, made him look closer to the man Dottie had said he used to be, before the losses had stacked up. She filed the image away like something worth keeping. They were married in April, with the snow gone and the first green coming up in the pastures, and Dottie crying into a dishcloth she pretended was for something else. The ceremony was short and the party after it was long, which was the right proportion.
Maura wore a dress the color of cream that she'd made herself with her mother's brooch at the collar, and she said the words clearly and meant all of them.
Her father came because she had invited him,
because she had decided that forgiveness did not require approval and could coexist with clear eyes.
He sat in the back and was very quiet. When he left, he pressed her hand briefly, and she let him, and that was enough. Later, after everyone had gone, she stood on the porch in the dark and looked at the pasture and listened to the cattle settling and felt the particular quality of a thing that had come to its right shape after being wrong for a long time.
Reid came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything.
He was good at not saying things that didn't need to be said, which was a quality she had come to appreciate more than she'd have expected. She leaned slightly into his shoulder. He stayed solid.
The sky above Cutter's Bend was full of stars. The kind of stars that only appeared in places where the dark was truly dark, and the wind was gentle, and the house behind them was warm. She had not chosen to come here, she had chosen to stay.
The difference between those two things was everything, and she knew it, and she was glad.